Welcome to Leesburg Public Library virtually. Today's history presentation is by reference librarian Robert Voyles on the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Welcome, Robert.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. As Deb said, I'm Robert Voyles. I'm one of the adult services librarians here at the Leesburg Public Library. Just a little bit about myself. I have a master's degree in library and information science, and my undergraduate bachelor's degree is in history with a concentration in American history. And particular of interest is revolutionary, colonial, early national period American history. Today's topic that I wanted to kind of do like a little survey of is I titled CONCON 1787, Constitutional Convention. CONCON, the naming conventions of naming conventions, like Comic-Con, MegaCon, FloridaCon. I thought it would be a little funny for it to be CONCON. It's topical. This week starts Constitution Week on Friday, which is Constitution Day. It is the 234th anniversary of when the Constitution, the convention ended, and the Constitution that we currently operate under was signed by most of the delegates. It was not known as the Constitutional Convention at the time. It was known as the Federal Convention, the Philadelphia Convention where it took place, or the Grand Convention at Philadelphia. And what the Constitutional Convention was, just in short, was a gathering of representatives from all the states that had declared independence from Great Britain during the American Revolution, minus one, but we'll get to that. It was a convention amongst the delegates to essentially figure out what was wrong with the country in terms of their government structure and how they could fix the problems that they were facing. I tried to make as concise of a timeline of what we're going to address for the actual Constitution and the Constitutional Convention. You can find the origins of our Constitution all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1214, but we're not going to go that far. We're just pretty much going to talk about everything immediately preceding, during, and after the convention. So the Constitution of the United States, it went into effect in 1789, and it's still what we operate under. It's what our government is operating under to this day. This document is it's our national. It essentially established our national government and the fundamental laws of what we base everything, all the laws that we make on, whether the Constitution allows it or not. I said before, it's going to be 234 years come Friday, 234 years old. Constitution Day is Friday. The Constitution, I should say, Constitution Day starts Constitution Week, and that always runs from the first day on Constitution Day until the 17th of September until the 23rd of September every year. The significance of the Constitution and its impact on our country's history can't be understated at all. It's probably the most important document in our nation. Some could debate that the Declaration of Independence is, but this is the one that we've been using for over two centuries. There is a reason why we needed the Constitution. There's a reason why we still use it today. It was constructed, debated, and signed, and it is the oldest and shortest codified written Constitution still in use today. Many people will say that there's arguments over San Marino, this very, very tiny country in Italy, has the oldest one, but ours is the only codified one that's still in use. Written down laws, specifically articles, this, that. So it is very unique in world history. It contains a preamble, 7 articles, the signatures of the delegates at the convention, the endorsements, and eventually up to today, it has 27 amendments. that have been added since the original ratification. And the most recent amendment actually was from 1992, so not that long ago. It was originally in the custody of the State Department after it was after our national government had been established from the Constitution. And the physical document actually can be found on display at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., along with the Declaration of Independence. And both these documents are titled as the Charters of Freedom. So if anyone's ever been to DC, seen them on display, I actually have not, and it's on my bucket list. So, all right. So we're going to start from the events that led up to the convention, the road to the convention, and pretty much the Constitutional Convention was seen as a necessity by all the movers and shakers of the country at the time, for our young nation. That isn't to say that there were people that were vehemently against kind of having a new form of government or any kind of changes to the current government they were operating under. We declared independence in 1776, as most probably do know. And we actually operated under a different form of government since 1777, technically 1781. 1777 is when the Articles of Confederation, which was our first constitution, actually came into effect when it was ratified by all the states in 1781. It was a post-revolutionary government. It was the first one. A lot of people, I like to think of it, a lot of people like to say that France is one of those countries that had government after government after government after government. And it's ironic that in 11 years that we're the ones that had 4 different governments, from, the British monarchy to essentially a conglomeration of independent states to, a confederation, and then eventually a union of the United States. So the central government at the time of the Articles of Confederation was designed specifically to be very, very weak. And you have to remember that these men had essentially rebelled against a tyrannical central government of the British monarchy and Parliament specifically, because they were not represented, their interests were not represented, and they were essentially ignored. So that was kind of always the fear in the back of the mind of all these men, people in the country. They did not want another tyrannical government essentially telling them what to do, taking away their freedoms, taxing them, all these different authorities that their old government had that they don't want to continue into the next one. The setup of the actual Articles of Confederation, the Confederation Congress, it was an assembly of every single former colony, all the states, the 13 states. They had one vote, and everything had to essentially be required to have 9 out of 13 votes to pass any kind of law. Obviously, this is really, really, really hard to do, and not a lot got done. They also had essentially no authority to do most of the things to kind of fund their mandates, I should say. Even amending the articles required unanimous consent. And there were rivalries even between the states at the time, large states and small states, territorial claims. So no one kind of wanted to give an inch on anything, especially when it came to trying to give more power to a central authority that they didn't necessarily control on their own. They had no authority to enforce tax collection. They couldn't back paper currency or even maintain an army. War era debt during the Revolutionary War went unpaid, and it caused a lot of economic turmoil in the colonies. So there was not a lot of bright spots right when the country got its independence and started kind of walking on its own 2 legs. They were not in a good condition. The individual states conducted their own foreign policies and had their own money systems, and it just made trade incredibly difficult. There was a rebellion even in Western Massachusetts over farmers being essentially overburdened with taxation and debt because their paper money was worthless. People weren't getting paid. It all boiled down to the almighty dollar for them. They had to be put down by the Massachusetts state militia and a privately funded militia because the Confederation Congress couldn't even do anything to it because they had no authority. So pretty much the Articles of Confederation were a glorified treaty, essentially just making the United States, what it was then, just a federation of independent countries that had a common defense treaty, which is pretty much what played out during the Revolutionary War, as opposed to today where, the federal government pretty much dictate, constitutionally what they're allowed to, supersedes all the other states for a common purpose. Switch that yet. So what pretty much the last little bit of information before the actual convention was the Annapolis Convention, which was a preceding one that had 5 states represented with 12 delegates. The official title was the Meeting of Commissioners to Remedy Defects of the Federal Government. Everyone saw that there were problems. It was a matter of how to deal with them. And they wanted to remove these trade barriers so that they can increase essentially their economy, figure out how to make people money. They realized that they would need all the states kind of to participate if they actually wanted to make actual change. So those delegates at that convention decided to meet in Philadelphia with every state. They sent out a call to the legislators to essentially start the convention, the Grand Convention at Philadelphia, the Federal Convention, to revise the Articles of Confederation. Mind you, it's just revise, not throw out, not replace, just to make amendments to itself. Okay, so that was set in motion. So now pretty much where we're going to come to is where the convention was at. It was in Philadelphia, the old Pennsylvania State House. We call it Independence Hall now. It's where both the First and Second Continental Congresses met, where during the Revolution, right before the Revolution, all the delegates met there, signed the Declaration of Independence, where the Confederation Congress had met in the beginning until 1783, where it eventually would move away from Philadelphia. Yeah, Philadelphia is very important back then. I mean, it's still an important city, but back then it was the epicenter of colonial life and early life in the early national period of America. It was the most populous city, and a lot of the most important people actually came from Pennsylvania and Philadelphia specifically, and it was a pretty central location for a lot of the states. Now, we're going to talk about who's who at the Constitutional Convention. There were 70 appointed delegates at the convention. 55 actually showed up at one point or another. Not everyone showed up at the same time. Travel was always a problem, so that's why not everyone was able to get there. 12 out of the 13 states participated. Rhode Island is pretty much what we would consider the problem child of the 13 colonies. They didn't want to give any more power to a federal, a central authority. They thought things were fine the way they were. So they didn't even bother sending any delegates to the actual convention. So only 12 states actually participated, and Rhode Island chose not to in any way. There was a letter, I'm going to quote, letter from certain citizens of Rhode Island to the Federal Convention, where there was a significant merchant class, especially in Providence, Rhode Island, that were interested because it affected them in terms of trade and economic prosperity and such. They were in favor of essentially revising the Articles of Confederation. They wanted a new system that worked for them. But the powers that be did not want anything to kind of infringe on their their powers that they were currently exercising. So delegates from New Hampshire actually arrived 2 months after the start of the convention, and New York delegates had actually abandoned the convention before they even showed up. So Alexander Hamilton was the only person from New York to actually stick it out there with the convention and the debates, and essentially what the final product was, the Constitution, as well as being very, very important and influential, being from New York in terms of ratifying the Constitution later on in New York on the debate floor in that state legislature. We have specific individuals that's important to point out is George Washington, hero of the Revolution, probably the most famous man in America, arguably the world. At some point, he was named unanimously as the president of the convention, so he presided over it. He was in favor. He was actually convinced to come out of retirement. A lot of people compare him to Cincinnatus of the Roman Republic, military leader who comes in to help save his country and then wants to go back quietly and be a farmer. And he tried to do that, but people needed him. His voice was very important and held a lot of gravitas for the nation as a whole. And if he put his weight behind something like this, then it has a much greater chance of success. We also see James Madison. He is often coined as the father of the Constitution. It's his brainchild. He was the one that pushed for it. He wanted the new system kind of with more central authority. Most of the people at the convention did. They wanted a stronger federal government. But he is the one that pretty much came up with most of the plans for it in terms of political philosophy and how the structure of the government would come about, with compromise and discussion and debate with other people. Then there's Benjamin Franklin, oldest delegate from Pennsylvania, oldest delegate. Funny story about him is, he, I don't remember his exact age, but he was in his 80s. Could barely walk. He was riddled with gout. So he was actually ended up being carried to the convention on a sedan chair by prisoners on multiple occasions, at the start of the day for the conventions, for the meetings. So, some people like to end up like Cleopatra. And then we have I mentioned Alexander Hamilton, super important in terms of pro-constitution, really wanted this new system. And then other important people that you may not have ever heard of, but they are extremely, extremely influential in the whole process. And that's Gouverneur Morris, George Mason, Roger Sherman, Charles Pinckney, James Wilson, and William Patterson. And there were others, but these people kind of made a footprint if you know anything about the dealings. There we go. The long summer. This pretty much is the time frame of the convention. It was set to start on May 14th in 1787, but the quorum wasn't met. Only 2 states had actually had people arrive on time. I mentioned that travel was very difficult back in the day. Only Virginia and Pennsylvania, obviously, Pennsylvania had people there on May 14th. So they had to wait until May 25th when a quorum was actually met, the amount of states that would show up to essentially start the proceedings. It would last 116 days from May 25th until September 17th. The delegates all agreed to keep their deliberations secret, enabling the participants to express opinions freely, to advance tentative proposals, reconsider decisions without being publicly chastised. Being considered, they don't want to be seen as inconsistent because they were convinced that another idea was better. And it just allowed them to negotiate and bargain and compromise without any pressure on them. Interesting enough, because it was secret, the windows were closed to prevent eavesdroppers. And remember, it's the summer, it got hot, there was no air conditioning back then. It's also considered a tactic to kind of like sweat people out, make things go quicker. People just want to be done. So it definitely was hot, stuffy, and smelly in there. All these, think of hygiene back in the day, but it was also a ploy to kind of like make this process go a little quicker. And although that they wanted to keep everyone kind of hush hush about the whole ordeal, that was only at the time until they can come up with something. James Madison actually knew that this was going to be grandiose and how historically important this was. That he got permission to actually record notes for the debates. And other people helped him by giving copies or outlines of their own notes. His notes, which were published after his death, are considered one of the most practical and dependable sources of information concerning the debates of the Constitution. But recollections of other delegates written after the fact they do supplement them. And yeah, so, and as mentioned previously, the whole point of this was essentially to make changes to the national government, the way that the Union was between the 13 states. Whether or not it was to make new amendments to the Articles of Confederation, if they can get everyone on board, which they couldn't because amendments had to be unanimous and Rhode Island was not there. So they knew that wasn't going to work. So essentially what happened is they knew they were going to have to come up with a completely new form of government. Essentially scrap the Articles of Confederation and make what is now the U.S. Constitution. And topics to discuss would include representation, which was very important to them from the Revolutionary days. How was each state going to be represented? How were the people in the states going to be represented? Interstate commerce, trade, money, it's always important. The economy, taxation. They had this issue before in terms of being taxed, how much they can be taxed, who can tax, and the actual structure of the national government. Because right now they only operated under a unicameral, a single house of a legislature. That was their national government. Very different from what we have today. And these, there would be numerous committees when trying to figure out these different ideas of what would make the Constitution work, what would make our new government work. You would have the Committee of the Whole, which was essentially set up from the beginning. And these, I'll go down to the Committee of Detail, the Grand Committee, and the Committee of Style and Arrangement. The committees were there to focus kind of more on the minutiae, the finer details of things. Debates were obviously amongst all the delegates, but these are the people that kind of like hash out agreements. Most of them had representatives from most of the states on these committees, at least one person. With the exception of the last one, the Style and Arrangement. Style and Arrangement was essentially the committee to make the final draft of the Constitution that everyone would sign. They didn't actually have anyone from the small states, which can be debatable in terms of whether that mattered or not. But a lot of the debates centered on plans that were introduced. People had developed their own ideas and submitted plans to the debate floor to be discussed and voted on whether or not they should be included in the new government. You have the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, the Connecticut Compromise, the Pinckney Plan, and the British Plan. I'll go into more detail with the Virginia, New Jersey, and Connecticut plans. The Pinckney and British plans, they were significant for who actually sponsored them. They had some similar ideas to the other plans and others that were a little more immediately tossed out, like no one really wanted it. But some of these were just developed at the last resort as something to show that they did something and discussed something, and they they could say they tried. All right. So the Virginia plan. This was the first plan that was essentially proposed. It was sponsored by Edmund Randolph, who was the governor of Virginia at the time, although the plan was written by James Madison. It's also called the Large State Plan because it emphasized representation in their legislature through population or tax contribution. So this is something that would favor larger states like Virginia, like New York, Pennsylvania, over smaller states like Rhode Island, who's not even there, or Connecticut, or New Jersey, which we're going to get to. There's this chart here. You can kind of, a lot of it's a little overcomplicated because essentially most of it is useless at this point because we don't operate under a government structure like this. Only certain things were taken from it. You could see that the first branch would actually, right here, would actually elect the second branch. So there were two, is bicameral legislature. So like we have two houses, but one house elects the other house. And they came from state legislators, like the nominees. So they would pick essentially from the state's choices. And that's kind of how you be even from when the Constitution was founded until this century, the 20th century, where senators were not picked by the people. They were picked by the state legislators. We didn't get to pick who got to go into the Senate. Let's see. Yeah, so the Virginia plan was not adopted in its entirety. It also, it added more powers. Most of the plans added powers to the national legislature. They needed to be able to do the things that the government had to get done. These mandates should not have gone unfunded or toothless. They needed to be able to essentially carry out the wishes of the people through the government. So they would have certain powers. Madison, he believed in a strong central government. That was the solution to their problem. He was against factions controlling the government. And he felt that, even though that states could be controlled by certain factions, that a national government essentially couldn't be. And a national government that couldn't be controlled essentially by one group of people could keep everyone in check. This idea of competing factions. It's just an idea of this is where the push for republicanism kind of came in, that we are a republic today. They didn't want a tyranny of the majority. And that's kind of one of the larger premises of like the political philosophy of them back in the day is tyranny can come from anyone. It can come from a minority, a king. A king is a minority, but tyranny comes from that. And it's a majority, even though everyone votes, mob democracy and such, they despise that just as much as despotism, as much as just one person making decisions for everyone. So the idea was to insulate these people. That's why they have, you elect a representative, then the representative elects someone else. It's these layers of insulation so that not everything is pressured by directly the people, or, there's certain checks and balances where from the top down, that not everyone can do that. All right, so the New Jersey plan, I will just add that the Virginia plan does introduce the idea that there's multiple branches of government, that it's not just the legislature. There's also an executive and a judicial branch. We didn't have a judicial branch or an executive in the sense that we have today under the Articles of Confederation. These plans are the ones that are going to introduce the multiple branches of government and what we'll eventually get out of the Constitution. The New Jersey plan, known as the Patterson Plan for James Patterson, the person who presented it, or the Small State Plan. It favored lower population states. It was a reactionary plan. It was presented essentially in response to the Virginia plan. The New Jersey plan only acknowledged that the Articles of Confederation only needed to be amended. It's not essentially pushing for a brand new rewritten constitution or a new form of government. It thought that it could kind of just like tweak what's in the Articles of Confederation. The whole point of it was that in keeping with that kind of philosophy, it's that there's still only going to be one legislature, a unicameral legislature, and each state is going to get one vote, just like the Confederation Congress. This is pushing the idea of equal representation so that they essentially are on a level playing field with larger states like Virginia, like New York and Pennsylvania, as I mentioned before. All the small states want kind of a fighting chance when it comes to deciding matters of state at the national level, especially one that would have more power. Yes, so other new powers granted to the national government would include raising funds through tariffs, taxation of states based on population, and regulating interstate commerce. There will be a federal executive chosen by the legislature, so it's not like a popular vote. It's sort of similar to how the Electoral College is run, but what we ultimately end up with can have today. But yeah, but it's still different. It's much like the Virginia plan in that regard. And a judiciary. There will be judges now to essentially offer that. The whole point of having the judges is a court system to determine legality of things. Crazy that it didn't happen before at a national level, when they had laws. Yeah, so I mean, this plan was immediately rejected. It only had 3 votes in favor of it from small states. But the important thing about the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan is that they both introduced provisions and concepts that a lot of people could agree on, not in its totality, but they could pick and choose like a buffet of what things they liked. And that's exactly what's going to happen when it comes to the Connecticut Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise, called so due to the Connecticut delegation introducing it, kind of hashing it out. Roger Sherman was the man behind it. It's also called the Great Compromise. And it pretty much was the end result of the debate over representation in the national government. After the New Jersey plan was voted down, a committee was formed with a representative from each state, the Grand Committee, as I mentioned the committees before. And pretty much it was them pulling aspects of both the Virginia and New Jersey plans to kind of mash into one. And that's where we get today's House of Representatives and Senate, one based on population and one based on equal representation. And there's even caveats in it where you can see on the thing, on the the slide, origin of revenue bills. That was to appease large states. Large states essentially wanted the power of the purse string to come from the legislative body that they would have more control in, because there's more people, more of a tax base. So when things are influencing what gets taxed, they want kind of more control over it, or at least more of a say. And in the Senate, everyone's equal. Everyone has a vote, much like the Confederation Congress, but they wanted to avoid some of the problems that came in the Confederation Congress, where essentially the state delegations voted as one. So, and that's where you get 2 representatives for each state, where a state can be split. One representative can vote one way, and another one can vote another way. So, these provisions were the outline for what would eventually be written into the final draft of our Constitution. In terms of representation and the legislature. So one of the other topics for just kind of examining the Constitution itself um, in today's world, as it was written back then, 234 years ago. Its criticisms. Today things are completely different. Things were not the same over 200 years ago. They wouldn't line up with our current standards and practices, our morals, that we've kind of progressed as a nation, as a society, and as a people. A lot of people like to say, I like to say even, what would the founding fathers do when thinking of something that, the current issues that face our government and our society. And historical context does speak volumes when interpreting the actions and words of individuals and societies. Not everything is applicable. You can't assume that George Washington or Thomas Jefferson is to have, an opinion or be right about something that's, something in today. Something can be said of kind of the originalist interpretation of the Constitution, and whether that's up for debate. That's a constitutional question for the courts and lawyers, but it's something to consider when taking things into putting things in context. With what we find in the Constitution back then, we still find it's still written, but it has changed thanks to amendments. One of the most glaring criticisms was the practice of slavery. It was a contentious issue then, as it would eventually boil up to the Civil War. Chattel slavery of Black men, women, and children was very predominant in the South. It existed in the North, in states, but the North was on a path of eventuality to emancipation, where slavery wasn't something that was a societal necessity for their economy like it was in the South. So they didn't see it as a huge kind of a consideration for them. And they didn't need it. Most people knew slavery was immoral back then. But a lot of people had their blinders on, that would normally just personally disagree with it, to achieve a higher objective. They wanted national unity, and that was essentially a bargain was struck, to push the issue of slavery off, where states could still deal with it. But there was always a greater good to be served, and that was their justification for it. Like, the words slave and slavery do not appear in the Constitution, but there are provisions that clearly reference slaves and slavery. The slave trade clause prohibited Congress from interfering with the importation of persons. It was a direct reference to the African slave trade, until the year 1808. Essentially, they were given a sunset date for the international slave trade. So people couldn't essentially purchase more slaves on ships, coming from Africa, from other nations. The domestic slave trade was going to be alive and well until the Civil War, which arguably was larger than the international one. But in 1807 is when a law was passed that essentially would go into effect the next year to prohibit the international slave trade. The Fugitives from Labor Clause prohibited states from freeing slaves who fled to another state that would be free. You see that issue come up towards the, leading up to the Civil War with fugitive slave acts. People were still arguing over that issue. The 3/5 Compromise is probably the most infamous provision regarding slavery and the Constitution. Outside of its just existence, it was essentially a bargain, another bargain, to determine the amount of representation that a Black slave could be counted as when determining apportionment in the national legislatures. Other persons, in quotes, other persons, as defined in the Constitution, essentially by default is a slave. A person would be someone who is a free person. they would count as 3/5 of a free citizen, and it's for tax and representation purposes. And so, the rights and privileges of citizens were by default reserved for men as well. Moving on to another group of people who kind of got the shaft over 200 years ago. Women in the world in general were excluded from the political realm, the public sphere. They were seen as homemakers, child rearers. They were supposed to take care of the family. This cult of domesticity that arose in America in the early national period. That's pretty much kind of in line with how the Constitution would play out. Pretty much the federal government, what the Constitution would lay out was that the states got to decide what the voting requirements would be, and all states restricted women from voting, with the exception of New Jersey, but that was only temporary. It eventually would revoke that as well. The amendments are the things that kind of like put the spotlight on these issues, because the fact that they had to be passed and they had to be defined. 13th Amendment essentially outlawing slavery in the country. The 19th Amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote. And then just in general of citizenship. People who could vote, you had to be essentially a white male with property. Different states had different levels of what property constituted of. It could have just been $40 back then in your pocket, which would have been a lot more money here today, but or a certain amount of land. But then you have the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, where it shows that everyone born in the United States is a citizen and can vote, and that you couldn't essentially discriminate against people who were once slaves or the color of their skin, that they weren't able to vote. But now, historically speaking, this didn't end the problem, but it essentially acknowledged that it was a problem. So now we're going to get to the actual kind of bits of the Constitution. I'm kind of just going to run through this. It's something that if you haven't actually read the Constitution, I would. It reads like a court document in most places, but it is what we base all our laws on in our country. You find something in there, it's where judges and lawyers and politicians all will derive some sort of authority or restriction in terms of what they want to do, how the government wants to act. So the preamble, the purpose of the preamble essentially sets out what the purpose of the Constitution is. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Like I said, it's an objective. It's been a source of inspiration. Also, some controversy in terms of what its actual purpose is. Is this a law? Can a judge say, well, based on the preamble, this law is legal? It's not essentially a list of powers and rights that the government can do. It's just very broad terms, very lofty goals that the whole point of the Constitution is to make sure that our country could do these things. We, the people, it signifies that the Constitution is essentially established by individuals. It gives power to the people. These aren't, state actors that is determined. The people will get to choose whether or not they want the Constitution set up. It's the people, as in the current, contemporarily, who would be able to have a voice in their government. To form a more perfect union, that is to say that this isn't the perfect union. The Constitution isn't creating the most perfect union. It's just saying that it's an improvement, and it is an improvement. It's essentially tying the binds of the states together even closer through the federal government, giving them more power and authority to move as one. We need to do that. And then just the list of reasons, ensure domestic tranquility, establish justice. These are all just goals. Like I mentioned before, just goals. The government can't provide for, the government is granted powers in the Constitution to provide for the common defense. But you wouldn't turn to the preamble to determine if that was legal or not. The end line, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That, I mentioned before that the protecting against tyranny is huge and in the back of all these people's minds. That's why the Constitution exists, and that's why a lot of it is clearly defined. Some of it's not, but a lot of it is clearly defined. People were worried that always worried about a tyrannical government. That was what the opponents of the Constitution were saying, that this is essentially making a tyrant, whereas others were saying, no, this is a controlled beast. We can control it as best as we can. It's, the net gain is it's a net positive for what we're giving and what we're going to get in terms of protecting future generations for their rights and liberties, the blessings of liberty. But like I said, the preamble should be considered a rhetorical blueprint of the Constitution's purpose. It's stylish words written by Gouverneur Morris. I mentioned him in talking about who's who. He's the one that actually wrote this. It's just to convey a message. And personally, I don't think it should have any kind of legal interpretation, but it's just something that's very artsy and enjoyable. So just to run through the articles. Article 1 deals with the legislative branch. We talked about that. It's the two branches, two houses, Senate and House of Representatives. Lists their authority, lists how it's structured, how the people essentially elected, and there are 18 powers that essentially they have that are explicitly listed in the Constitution. Then you have Article 2, which details the executive branch, our president. It's just lost my place. Yes. Yeah, it just discusses the establishment of a president and rules regarding that, his authority or her authority. And then Article 3 outlines the authority of the judicial branch, the new court system that the country is going to set up in the federal government. And then Article 4 discusses the relationship between each state and the new federal government. Article 5 goes over the amendment process. There's a couple different ways to amend the Constitution, whether it's the states deciding and holding a convention themselves, another convention like this one, or laws passed in Congress, and then it gets sent to the states for them to, 3/4 of them would have to ratify it for it to be included. And then Article 6 establishes the supremacy clause, which indicates that the federal government supersedes the states and matters of contradiction. Outside of things that are explicitly stated, that the federal government essentially has the authority to do. If there's something comes in conflict between a state government and a federal government, then the federal government essentially wins. It'll be decided in later court cases in the early national period and a couple decades after the Constitution, essentially, kind of hyper focusing on what things the states think they should be allowed to do and what the federal government has the right over them to do. And then Article 7 essentially describes the ratification of the Constitution, how the Constitution can get ratified, and that is to have 9 states ratify it after it leaves the convention. Then we have the drafting and signing of the Constitution. The Constitution itself was based on a lot of things. There's, I say the framing fathers. There's a difference between the founding fathers and the framing fathers. most of them overlap. But there were people that weren't in. I forgot to actually mention there weren't people that many people think were at the Constitutional Convention. Thomas Jefferson wasn't there. John Adams wasn't there. These men were serving as diplomats overseas under the Confederation government. Jefferson in France and Adams in England. These are two of the most important founding fathers, but they're not framing fathers. They had nothing to do with the Constitution. People had correspondence with Jefferson about it, but he had no real kind of pull on it. But in terms of what ended up being the Constitution, a lot of it came from a lot of political writing from the Enlightenment era. You have John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose writings influenced a lot of these framing fathers and founding fathers, a lot of overlapping principles as well too. And many state constitutions had existed since the Revolution, since they declared their independence. States have passed their own state constitutions that would reflect well if the federal government's constitution had actually adopted some of the provisions, and some of them did influence it, like the Virginia state constitution, in terms of a lot of the liberties and the powers granted to the government and the people. A lot of framework has already been set out. Even the Articles of Confederation, a lot of it is copied from the Articles of Confederation. A lot of people, there's arguments to be made that it was a good kind of a good base of what a government should be and needed to be tweaked. They ended up rewriting the whole government, but a lot of it, what was in the Articles of Confederation, made its way into the Constitution. The Committee of Style and Arrangement were the ones I mentioned before that were responsible for actually drafting the final Constitution after all the debates in Independence Hall. Everyone taking notes. They want this changed. This is what they voted on. They essentially had to come up with a final draft of what the Constitution was actually going to say, what law they were going to sign. And it is peculiar that the Constitution isn't without spelling errors and grammar mistakes. English was not actually standardized back then, so there are mistakes in terms of apostrophes, different spellings of different words in the same word spelled differently in the Constitution. The word Pennsylvania is literally misspelled in the Constitution. They didn't include one N. But yeah, so Gouverneur Morris is considered the chief draftsman of the Constitution. He was a delegate from Pennsylvania, originally from New York, strong confidant of George Washington. He is the one that is considered the, James Madison may be the philosophical father of the Constitution, but Gouverneur Morris is the one who wrote the final product in terms of what was going to be included. Hamilton was also involved as well, and both of them were dominated contributors in the convention and in the ratification efforts in the states afterwards. So when all was said and done and the document was presented, Benjamin Franklin actually gave a speech at the end of it, at the end of the convention, pretty much to convince everyone to sign it. He asked people to sign it. He told them that it was flawed. You weren't going to get around it. He's like, but this is the best thing that they were ever going to come up with. And he got 39 people to sign the Constitution after that speech on September 7th, 1787. There were 3 individuals who did not sign that were delegates. But they would fight against it in the state legislatures, specifically in Virginia. So, now that the Constitution is signed by the delegates, it would be sent to the Confederation Congress. And once there, they would send it to all the states, essentially, to have their state legislators hold a convention to ratify the Constitution. Delaware would be the first state to sign the Constitution, to ratify the Constitution. They are nicknamed the first state. and it was done by a unanimous vote. Several states would follow, but not without obstacles. Eventually, the Constitution would pass, obviously, with New Hampshire as the ninth state to ratify it. And that's due to Article 7 of the Constitution itself. It says once 9 out of the 13 states they would pass, the Constitution would come into effect. So after the actual convention, there were many conventions after the fact. It wasn't just 13 because states had different states had multiple conventions. In terms of whether or not they accept the Constitution or not, as it is written. There were ideological, and eventually they would turn into political parties in terms of how to interpret the Constitution over adopting the actual Constitution. You have the Federalists, whose moniker essentially comes from the system of government of federalism between the federal government and the states. And then you have the Anti-Federalists, very original name makers, pretty much just opposite of the Federalists. Federalists wanted the strong central government that the Constitution established. Anti-Federalists wanted to disavow the Constitution, and they wanted states to essentially be the supreme power in determining their fates as government actors. In the months that would follow the convention, a lot of the states would take up the debates. Delaware was the first. Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey all ratified it in December of the following the convention. So 3 months later. Then would follow Georgia, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. Massachusetts specifically, two individuals that were not present at the convention, John Hancock and Samuel Adams, very important people during the Revolution. They were anti-federalists. They fought against the Constitution in the debate floor at the Massachusetts ratifying convention. But what eventually ended up happening was what's called the Massachusetts Compromise. And they ratified the Constitution on the condition that there would be a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights essentially would become a list of amendments that they wanted to add to the Constitution. Like I said, it was conditional. Bill of Rights would eventually come within the year after the Constitution was in effect and the new government was set up. But as of now, most Federalists who were in favor of the Constitution didn't believe that there should be a Bill of Rights. They wanted to point out that by pointing out specific things that were protected, that people were protected against the government, meant that the government could do anything else that wasn't in those listed Bill of Rights. So, it's kind of a philosophical debate on how to interpret the Constitution, kind of boiling it down to that. Yes, so the only state to hold out until the last state, I should say, was Rhode Island to actually ratify the Constitution. They eventually would. They held multiple state conventions and even had a statewide referendum that overwhelmingly rejected the Constitution. Supporters of the Constitution in Providence, like I mentioned before, that there was a merchant class, essentially. Once New Hampshire had ratified the Constitution, bring it into effect, they wanted to celebrate in Providence, these Rhode Islanders who supported the Constitution. And there was almost a civil war. Armed militia actually showed up, and they were on the precipice of fighting each other over it. But Rhode Island would eventually ratify the Constitution once all the other states did, and they were essentially threatened with an embargo by law of the new Congress that would come up, banning trade with Rhode Island, essentially starving them and crippling them. So they gave it. And then the ratification battles, there are a couple things to specifically highlight. The Federalist Papers, let me mention something before. The Constitution essentially already went into effect. New Hampshire ratified it. That makes 9 states. Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island were the only states left that did not actually ratify it. What makes it interesting is that these states didn't have to ratify it, although the consequences of not ratifying it were kind of left up in the air. What would happen if New York and Virginia, two of the two largest states in the union, chose not to be part of the union? Essentially chose to reject the Constitution, kind of being thorns in the side of this union of 9 states that existed. Would there have been a war? Would the government have actually even lasted? Would other states just be like, you know what, let's just all bail too? They're not in it. We'll never know, because Rhode Island was the only one that really held out. New York was the last state to ratify it before the new government was actually established, elections held, and George Washington was president. Congress was passing laws like the Bill of Rights. North Carolina would eventually ratify it in 1789 of November, and then the next year it would be Rhode Island. But the government was already set up and established at that point. So the Federalist Papers, specifically focusing on the New York Ratifying Convention and the Virginia ones, the Federalist Papers they're considered one of the most important philosophical writings, political philosophy writings in American history, and in the modern world, in modern history, you could say. It was a series of 85 articles and essays written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, supporting the Constitution. These were essentially to convince the public and the people that were involved in the convention the importance of why the Constitution should be ratified, making essentially arguments. They would bring up points about factions I mentioned before, about why a strong federal government would help essentially help competition and prevent someone from staying in power, or a group staying in power and controlling everything. The Federalist Papers were written specifically to influence the New York Ratifying Convention, but whether or not it actually influenced the actual debate is up for debate. There's no guarantee that they actually did anything. Writing back then, it's not a guarantee that everyone's going to be able to see it. People obviously read it, but you can't there's no definitive proof to say that this person read these articles and said, I'm changing my vote. You can make an assumption, but both New York and Virginia passed the ratification of the Constitution by incredibly narrow margins. I believe it was like 53% for both of them that it voted in favor. Virginia also debatably was influenced by the Federalist Papers. Virginia would end up ratifying the Constitution before New York. They both held their conventions in the summer of 1788. Virginia ratified first. This is in the aftermath of New Hampshire and seeing that the Constitution was going to happen no matter what. Both conventions kind of realized that you might as well ratify it. That's what kind of tipped it in the favor of the Federalists, even though both were dominated by anti-Federalists. So Virginia stipulated that they had the right to withdraw if they didn't like it in the end of the day. Madison was the one fighting on the floor, along with George Washington and Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, for the Constitution. Like I mentioned before, they didn't think the Bill of Rights was necessary, but Madison was actually persuaded to include a Bill of Rights. And he would actually be a congressman in the first Congress. And the Bill of Rights would come to fruition while he was in Congress. And then in New York Ratifying Convention, you had Hamilton up there with John Jay. They chose to ratify it, and they had sent out a circular letter which pretty much called for to essentially push for Article 5 in the Constitution, which was the states essentially having a second convention to address the amendment issue, what they wanted to change in the actual Constitution. So the tail end of the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. It's kind of like the cherry on it. It was passed within the year by Congress, and it would eventually get ratified by the states necessary. There were 13 original amendments passed by, I'm sorry, 12 original amendments passed by the first Congress to go to the states. So when an amendment gets passed by the Congress, it goes to the states to ratify the amendments. 2 of them did not get ratified in the time frame of the first 10 amendments. You have the First Amendment, free speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. Second one is the right to bear arms. Third one is the quartering of soldiers. Fourth one is about warrants and searches. Fifth one is due process, double jeopardy, self-incrimination, juries. Sixth Amendment is about a public trial. Seventh Amendment is with a jury. Eighth Amendment is about punishment, no cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment. So the first 3 amendments could be called safeguards of liberty. They're pretty much rights that individuals have that essentially that the government can't infringe on. And then the next 4 through 8 kind of are considered safeguards of justice, and they involve the justice system in terms of prosecuting individuals and what their protections are. And then the last 2, like I mentioned, Ninth Amendment is listed rights are not exclusive to the people, and the 10th Amendment is powers reserved to the states, and the people. It pretty much like my old teacher he said they're the "oh damn" amendments. It's pretty much guaranteeing that anything not explicitly listed in the Constitution by the federal, giving power to the federal government to do, it's reserved to the states and the people. They're the ones that get to exercise those rights. The federal government does not. Sure. But yeah, so there were initially 12 amendments. Ironically, one of them has still yet to reach ratification for the necessary states, but the second amendment that was originally proposed out of the original 12 actually was ratified. It's the most recent amendment we have. It was ratified in 1992. It involves pay raises in Congress. It's a funny story is that it kind of went the wayside of history, and it wasn't until about 40 years ago in the 80s when a student at a college actually wrote a paper about it and how it's still eligible to be passed. And he essentially started a whole movement for it, and it really was passed. He actually got a C on that paper. And then once the amendment was passed, the teacher actually went back and gave him an A because of that. So that's a little interesting story for the 27th Amendment. Yeah, so this pretty much concludes everything. I just wanted to leave a historical anecdote on about the Constitution. So the Constitutional Convention ended. All the delegates were leaving, and a woman came up to Benjamin Franklin, and she asked him, "What do we have, a republic or a monarchy?" Because that pretty much was what most people were debating on, what kind of government we would have. We had a monarchy before, and the idea was, can we do a republic? He responded with, "A republic if you can keep it." I still think that message rings true today. We have a republic that's been guarded diligently for 234 years. It is up to us to make sure that we remain a republic if that is what we want. Does the Constitution outline the best form of government? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. We only have our own experiences and history to teach us that. It's certainly been successful. It's certainly lasted a long time. It's lasted the longest time from what we have today. It's always been a work in progress, always been a work in progress, as you can see from the amendment process. I mean, granted, there is actually a 0% chance, almost a 0% chance of amendments actually passing. Over 11,000 amendments have been proposed, and we only have 27. So yeah, there is very infinitesimal that an amendment will get passed. But the fact that there was an amendment process in the Constitution that offered alternate kind of ways to change something in our nation's government shows what incredible foresight that the founders did have. And that to me shows what near perfection is giving the ability to change. I just want to kind of leave you off on like, what do you like about the Constitution? What are your criticisms? And what do you think we can do to protect our rights and freedoms in the Constitution that hasn't already been done? All questions to consider. You see the debate, the talking heads on television always arguing about what's constitutional, what's unconstitutional. We've seen it for 200 years in terms of actual interpretation of the Constitution, and will keep going until our country is no more in terms of what's right, what's wrong, what's legal, and what's not. And with that, it's the end of the survey of the Constitutional Convention. I want to thank you all for coming and listening to me talk. And I'm open to any questions that I can answer to the best of my ability.
Robert, we had a question come in chat. I am going to end the recording here so everybody can feel free to talk.